Hello everyone, and welcome to the first of many videos where I talk about the creative process of designing D&D encounters, dungeons, and so on to eventually make a dungeon 100 floors deep. If you're coming in fresh on this series, I hope I can provide some insight and knowledge on at least one approach to map making. I want to show people, especially newer fans of the hobby, how you might go about designing something like a dungeon to explore. I want to lift the sort of anxiety that I commonly hear from people when it comes to DMing a game. How do I even begin taking an idea I might have for a dungeon and start putting it down on paper, let alone making a whole map for it? How can I run a game without knowing the encyclopedia of rules? And I won't exaggerate, there is a lot to read if you want to be an expert in this game. That's daunting no matter who you are. But thankfully, a lot of those pages are full of edge cases or special rules or specific encounters that we don't need to understand going in. And part of the reason I want to use this vast dungeon is to help isolate the parts of D&D that we need to know or want to focus on one at a time and introduce them piece by piece so that you and, more importantly, your players aren't overwhelmed. Now, a few disclaimers. I by no means consider myself a master or even a notable expert in D&D. I'm sure I'm going to make some mistakes, and the quality of my maps aren't going to reach the illustrious expanses you might see in professional D&D games. That's not the point of this series. I don't want to flex any skills I may or may not have in creating things for D&D, but instead show that even without vast skills or artsmanship, anyone can still take an idea and transform it into a game they could be proud of to play with their friends. If you can take anything from this series, I hope it's that as long as everyone at your table has a good time, that's enough. With that out of the way, I want to talk about what our goals are for our first dungeon floor and the dungeon as a whole. What we're going to do is try to take some narrative or world themes that can hook and immerse players into the dungeon we're making, and combine them with a trickle of D&D mechanics that will keep them feeling engaged and challenged by the game's system. For narrative themes, we can turn to all manner of pop culture to give us inspiration. I chose mines and the small graveyard for this floor. Since it's the first floor, I wanted to pick themes that aren't inherently dangerous, and I wanted to keep things familiar since the first floor of a dungeon is likely to have been explored before, maybe even exploited in some way by civilizations on the surface. A mining operation is a good tool to express that, and the graveyard gives just enough of a sense of danger to make the floor interesting, even if the danger is merely perceived. It can also act as a source of mystery in the future, who or what is buried here and why. For the mechanics, we want to focus on the absolute core of D&D's rules, and for that I turned to the 2018 Basic Rules PDF available on the Wizards of the Coast site. The second part of that section covers the core of playing the game, and its 20 pages is much less intimidating. Because I want the first floor to be mostly devoid of threats, we're going to mostly skip the combat section of the rules here. Instead, we're going to focus on these core principles. How to make a check, basically how to determine success or failure in any task that isn't automatic, the different kind of checks you might perform, whether they're ability checks, saving throws, or in the future attack rolls, how proficiencies would apply to those checks, either by skill, tool, a weapon, or some other proficiency, and finally the conditions that might give someone advantage or disadvantage on a check, and what that advantage and disadvantage means. There are other minor features of this floor that are touched on, like how light works in 3 tiers, darkness, dim light, or bright light, and how your speed is affected by difficult terrain, but these are mostly just neat one-off features of a single room or obstacle, and they aren't focused on nearly as much. Once I understood what themes and mechanics I wanted to focus on, I went to work on drawing a simple floor plan of the map. I kept it linear, starting with a large room on the left and narrowing it to a small corridor running along the top side of the grid. This corridor veered right into 2 different rooms, another large room directly visible and within the center of the map, and a room on the right behind the door that would contain the stairs leading down to the next floor. From here, each section of the dungeon floor would have its own theme, a purpose or background or atmosphere, as well as something to engage the players with, usually some kind of challenge and preferably something that we decided to focus on for this floor. The challenges we're looking for here is going to be very simple because our toolbox, so to speak, is just based on the dozen or so pages we read in the basic rules. But as we master these tools and get more comfortable with them, we'll be able to start combining them together and experimenting with more specialized rules in the player's handbook. When we get really comfortable, we can even add our own tweaks to certain challenges and make them unique. We are the DM after all, so the rules are more like guidelines. I decided to start the players in a closed-off area and a locked door. I'm giving the players 3 different ways to deal with this lock, each one covering a different kind of ability check we can perform. The most obvious way is to break the door down, which is a sheer strength ability check with a medium difficulty. The other 2 ways involve special proficiencies that a player might have. Proficiency in the investigation skill can help them find the key under the unwelcoming doormat and is by far the easiest way to get in. Proficiency with these tools can help the player pick the lock, though it's the hardest option, emphasizing thievery and other tools as a sort of specialized ability that requires some investment. But depending on how you want to emphasize things, the exact difficulty of a task can always be tinkered with depending on the makeup of your group. Once the players get through the door, the light from the surface entrance above doesn't spill any farther and the players find the burial ground. Because it's in total darkness, the players might be tempted to light a torch or use their dark vision to see a bit more clearly. Depending on the nature of their sight, a perception check might be required to spot the notable features of the room, specifically the minecart rail, the soft mounds of dirt signifying a grave, and a 10-foot hole at the end of the rail. If a player is inclined and has the appropriate tool, they can dig up one of the graves, but with a failed Constitution saving throw, they might feel sick at the sight of the grisly remains and be poisoned for a minute. As a footnote, being poisoned gives you disadvantage on ability checks and attack rolls, but the duration is too low to honestly be a threat. This is more to demonstrate how saving throws work and touch on conditions in the game. It's also possible for players to fall into the hole if they stumble in and fail a dexterity saving throw, requiring an athletics check to climb out. This is also a demonstration of how saving throws work, and if the players above the pit reach down to help their victim out of the hole, it's a good opportunity to explain the help action and how advantage works. The players also get disadvantage in their perception checks if they stay in darkness, but this probably will not happen. If it does, feel free to lecture your players on the values of torches in a humorously mocking tone. The corridor on the north is a break from special checks as its only feature is the remains of a cave-in. The resulting clutter serves 3 purposes: to introduce difficult terrain to the players as a mechanic, to block the immediate pathway to the mining room, and to block out the immediate use of the mining cart in the next room. When the players get to the end, one of them will need to perform an acrobatics check to squeeze through the opening between the doorway and the rocks blocking the way. If you're familiar with the concept of character size, feel free to give them advantage or disadvantage if they're smaller or larger than medium size respectively. Alternatively, the players on either side can spend time using athletics to clear a path for everyone else, removing the need for acrobatics. We're in good shape here. We've touched on both ability checks and saving throws, and we've explored each type of ability check. We've explored a handful of different skills covering different major ability scores, and even touched on some advanced mechanics like conditions, movement, especially regarding difficult terrain, vision, and light sources. We might have even had the opportunity to explore HP and healing if someone took damage falling into the pit. If you've gotten this far, pat yourself on the back because we've managed to squeeze a lot of what makes D&D a game into just a few short rooms. Now it's time to give the players some rewards. The next room features an abandoned mining operation, and the dimly glowing purple crystals on the wall and in the cart provide an obvious focal point. The crystals are clearly valuable, but the crystals still embedded in the wall requires some pick-like instrument, like a miner's pick or a war pick, to dig out. Players might be tempted to take the loose crystals in the cart and pocket them, departing early for some quick cash. It depends on how valuable you want the crystals to be, though I would recommend around 50 gold per player for loose crystals and another 750 50 gold per player if they can find the time and tools to mine the rest of the crystals from the walls. Otherwise, unless players already have a pick available, they'll eventually want to explore the final room. The final room is brightly lit because a goblin has made this room their home, bringing some lanterns, a pickaxe, and a pot for cooking meals. We can assume the goblin is resting. The goblin becomes aware of the player's presence if they clear the rocks from the opening in the corridor or start mining away at the crystals. A goblin who hears rocks will eventually take the war pick on their side of the door and peek outside, closing and blocking the door if they see the players. If the players want to enter the last room now, they will have to out-athletics the goblin in a skill contest, a special kind of ability check where instead of using a flat difficulty class, the opposing character would roll their respective skill to set a dynamic difficulty. When the door is forced open, the goblin will turn and run away, or fight if you think it's appropriate and are comfortable with starting combat early. The players would need to succeed in another kind of contest, either persuasion or intimidation versus the goblin's insight, to convince or coerce the goblin to not run away. It's up to you then to decide the attitude of the goblin if the players try to speak to it in earnest. The goblin would immediately flee without blocking the door if they hear the clangs of crystals being mined, leaving their war pick behind. Finally, a few more loose bits of crystal can be found in the room for another small bit of change, and the stairs lay open for the players to explore deeper. And that covers all the big features of this floor. There are future plans you can always consider for players on how the long-term goals of this floor can be handled. They can hire miners to help harvest the crystals, or buy a war pick if they didn't manage to get the goblins. Or they can hire laborers to clear out the cave-in and allow themselves to use the mining cart. If they decide to use the mining cart, take care that they don't accidentally push the cart over the hole in the first room. There are a lot of advanced tips that I want to give for running D&D games, especially when it comes to the more advanced concepts, but the most important one I can share right now for brand new DMs is to focus on enjoying the immediate moment. Get confident with the rules you want to focus on, and keep a pulse on how your players are feeling about the challenges you give them. As we get more comfortable with our DM's toolbox, the more nuanced themes we'll cover will give us more opportunities to explore advanced concepts. And at the end of the day, getting a group of friends down and playing will be the best way to nail down your DMing style. If you made it to the end, I'm happy you found this interesting enough to stick through. There's a poll in the description where you can provide feedback on the dungeon and how you want its themes and mechanics to shift in the future. I'd really appreciate it if you took the time to fill it out, and also maybe subscribe and share a comment on the video. Either way, I'm looking forward to digging down to the next floor with you. Bye-bye!